Tube warbles on a lot here. Welcome to the sea backroscope. As we look back down through the tunnel of time and ponder the sometimes cracked viewpoint afforded by looking into the views afforded by the mirrors which guided those who were setting the direction for the furrow they were ploughing and expected us all to run down. So let's look back 100 years and see what was happening back in the days when this axe cut stump was a new thing upon the landscape. Because, you see, 100 years ago, Australia had its worst day in history. 9 years ago, there was a bushfire in Victoria, and 172 people died in one day. 100 years ago, Australia took part in a British diversionary tactic to take the pressure off the British troops on the Somme at a place called Fromelles in northern France, and 5,663 Australians were killed, wounded or injured, missing, killed, wounded or missing, and 2,500 Australians were killed. That's the worst day's dying that has ever happened in the history of Australia, not only since Federation, in the history of the continent. There's never been a day when 2,500 Aborigines died in one day. So Fromelles, the worst day in the history of Australia. Full stop, period, end of paragraph. Spacebar, spacebar, spacebar. So here we are, 100 years down the track. 19th of July, 2016. Let's go and have a bit of a look at what happened on the worst days dying in the history of Australia, bar none. Hello, Mrs. Whitetail. You're here for the wake of Sidler Earl, is that right? You would like to come and celebrate the life and times of Sidler Earl? Okay, Mrs. Whitetail. And you're Joey. I'll provide refreshments for you. Okay, come on. There you go. You can eat that. Sidler Earl was engaged to my father's Aunty Ruby. Aunty Ruby was a piano teacher in Armidale of some great repute, actually. Aunty Ruby taught a fellow called Peter Allen how to play the piano when he lived in Armidale before his father shot himself and he moved to Tenterfield, way before he went to America and married Liza Minnelli. Aunty Ruby was a significantly serious piano teacher. Sidler Earl was her fiancé. He joined up when Aunty Ruby's brother Les came back from Gallipoli and was promoted to sergeant and went to England. Sidler Earl went with him. Sidler Earl died at Fromelles, or perhaps Poizierres, but I think he died at Fromelles. So, Mrs. Whitetail and Joey, I will tell you the story of the Battle of Fromelles, which is the one which caused my Aunty Ruby to be my maiden aunt. Or to be absolutely properly, technically correct, my maiden great aunt. If thou art familiar with European geography, you'll already know where Fromelles is, and this little map will make a lot of sense. If, like myself, you're not so crash hot on European geography, then this will probably help a lot. That's where Fromelles is. And here is what my comprehensive Australian military history book has to say about the Battle of Fromelles. Anzac enthusiasm in those June and July days would never be repeated. At last the day is near when Australia's boys will be given an opportunity to show the world what we are made of, unquote, wrote one. Quote, tomorrow we hope to be on the road to Berlin, unquote. Another wrote that he, quote, felt quite cool and collected, unquote, and would, quote, put up a merry fight for old England, so 3 cheers for the Anzacs and the early ending of this sinful game, unquote. Others felt a premonition that they would not return. Near Armidale, at the point where Plumer's Second Army and Munro's First Army met, a German salient called, quote, Sugarloaf protruded into the British lines. Okay. A sugarloaf was a conical, moulded lump of sugar, right? Flat base, round base, cone-shaped. You'll hear people speak of Sugarloaf Mountain, Sugarloaf Hill. It means a cone-shaped hill because about 150 to 250 years ago, that's how sugar was sold in Europe. Cone-shaped, quote, loaves. That's what a sugarloaf is. Lieutenant General Hacking of 11 Corps, just south of 2nd Anzac Corps, pressed for a combined artillery and infantry attack on it. If successful, even Aubers Ridge could be within grasp. 2 divisions would attack on a 4,000-metre front after heavy preliminary bombardment. The divisions chosen were the 61st British and the 5th Australian Infantry Division, 1st Australian Imperial Forces. Birdwood and White were filled with foreboding. Artillery was so inadequate that the 5th Division had to borrow guns from the 4th. A steady drizzle that turned the roads to mud exhausted the men of the 5th Division as they slogged up the line observed by the enemy on Aubers Ridge. But 19 July 1916 dawned fine, and the troops were in high spirits when the general advance began at 6 p.m. They had 3 hours of light left in which to seize Sugarloaf. On the left, where no man's land was only 200 metres wide, it was crossed by 2 brigades, and the infantry took the first German trench lines. But the 3rd enemy trench line could not be found, and the troops hurriedly began fortifying a huge ditch, throwing up parapets and filling sandbags with mud. It was on the extreme right, the western edge, where the trouble began. The 3rd Australian Brigade, the 15th, walked into heavy machine gun fire but pressed on, its survivors huddling in ditches. Their commander, quote, Pompey, unquote, Elliot, was unaware that the British 61st Division had been forced back by grenade attacks. While the Corps commander calmly made plans to renew the British attack the next day, the Australians stranded in the captured German lines were then subjected to the full weight of a counterattack by German reserves. Young officers led their men back to the Australian lines, fighting as they went. At 8 a.m. on the 20th of July, the isolated 8th Brigade was finally ordered to withdraw. Some of the men refused to believe it. Men attempted to recross no man's land in full view of the enemy machine gunners and were cut down. Other pockets of Australians fought on in the ditches they had gained until they were overwhelmed. This was the battle called Fromelles, described by Haig's GHQ as, quote, some important raids. The British division had lost 1,547, that's bracket in total. The 5th Division in its first battle had suffered 5,533 casualties total. From no man's land could be heard the cries of the wounded. One survivor wrote, thank God, I'm alive. It was like a butcher's shop. By hell, we caught it, and those who think this war is nearly over are in for some surprises. So, not 5,663, 5,533. And not only, but also, there is the mystery of Fromelles. Yes, you want to hear that, don't you? You thought I was joking. The mystery of Fromelles. The Battle of Fromelles has been described as, quote, the worst 24 hours in Australia's entire history. More Australians died here in just one day than in the Korean and Vietnam Wars combined. Of the, actually about twice as, 3 times as many, 2,600 versus 500 for Vietnam and 300 for Korea and 3 8 of 24. So, yeah, 3 times as many as Vietnam and Korea combined. Of the 5,533 casualties, killed, wounded and missing, hundreds remained unaccounted for. Where were their remains? In 2008, a Victorian schoolteacher with a fascination for military history, Lambus Engelizos, began examining the site of the battle, searching for mass graves. Soon, university researchers and the Australian government involved themselves in the search for the missing. Aerial surveys showed unusual formations in the fields surrounding the village. Excavating began. Soon, a number of mass graves were unearthed, and by mid-2011, a total of 250 bodies had been discovered. Using DNA, 110 Australian bodies were identified. They were buried with full military honours in a cemetery dedicated to their memory on the 95th anniversary of the battle, 19 July 2011. A German soldier who survived the Battle of Fromelles was an Austrian serving with the 16th Bavarian Reserve Regiment. His name was Adolf Hitler. He was awarded an Iron Cross for bravery under fire, but was otherwise undistinguished. He was never commissioned, for he seemed to lack leadership abilities. In 1941, an Austrian officer, patently anti-Nazi, told an Australian captured on Crete that Australians were responsible for the current war because they should have got rid of Hitler at Fromelles. Isn't that an interesting idea? Australians were responsible for the entire German activity in the Second World War because Australians failed to kill Adolf Hitler at Fromelles 100 years ago today. And of course, by the way, this would have to be a malt liquor video because this is a wake. It's a wake for Aunty Ruby's fiancé, Sidler Earl. The young fella who never made it back to Armidale, to Dangersley, to his fiancée, the preacher and teacher's daughter who supported herself as a music teacher, who donated a pew to the Presbyterian Church in Armidale, named in honour of Sidler Earl. And until she got to be too old to walk up the road from her flat to the church, she went and sat in Sidler Earl's memorial pew every Sunday for the rest of her life. My maiden aunt, Aunty Ruby, the wake for Sidler Earl. If I don't get pissed to remember him, who the fuck else will? Is that not right? There you go. I thank you for your patience. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Happy anniversary of the Battle of Fromelles. Ciao.